How's it going? Well, a couple of weeks ago, we recorded our 8th weekly Rememberize webinar for 2020. And, technical difficulties happened. And that day we had a little technical difficulty. We actually had about 30 minutes into our discussion. We had a power surge here at the house, lost our internet feed. It rebooted. And we had about 5-10 minutes left in the conversation and some examples I was trying to show as we had our discussion. And I wanted to come back and show those examples. So I restarted a Zoom meeting and shared the examples with the intent of recording it so that we could tag it on to the end of the video. Well, whether it was me or Zoom, or I'm going to blame them, but it was probably my fault. That short recording recorded over the original meeting. So we didn't have the full discussion of webinar 8. And my initial thinking was we just let it go and leave it. But as I think back on webinar 8, it was a discussion with Robin Tuck and Paula Johnson and myself. We talked about some things that specifically were related to some questions that Robin had asked. And while we won't have him here today, I'm going to try to recreate the information that we discussed in that Zoom meeting. And so hopefully this webinar will be helpful to people, even if you don't have his insights and his style. So, but I want to talk about the questions he asked and the answers to them and show some of the PowerPoint slides and some of the examples that I showed as we talked about his questions, because I think it's helpful information. So I apologize for not having the guests. I apologize for the delay in delivering it. And I apologize for the redo, but hopefully the information's helpful. So I'm going to share the screen. We're going to dive into this webinar, week 8. And I'm not going to do it in slideshow. I'm just going to keep it here in this mode because there's not that many slides. There's some other examples I'm going to show in a minute. So, details and content. What's needed to make my story powerful? And it comes from these questions that Robin asked. The first one was, how long should a story be? Personal history story. Is there a minimum or a maximum and a maximum length? And then his associated question was, how detailed should it be? And what about wordiness? Should our writing be terse or more fluid or somewhere in between? So those are some interesting questions. We're going to talk about the answers. Other questions he asked is, should I keep the words I use at some low level, such as 6th grade level with short sentences, or is it permissible to use big words and long sentences? And is it okay to write how I talk? And the rest of his other question was, what about using colloquialisms? Perhaps words and word usage unique to an area or a time. For example, several days ago, I was helping a friend take the dead wood out of a lot they purchased, and his wife stepped on a stub, which I removed by digging it out. I'm sure they had never heard the word stub before, but probably understood what I meant based on the context of the situation. And then he added, I just looked it up to make sure it's a real word, meaning what I thought it meant. So as we think about those questions in our writing, and those are interesting questions because they relate to the reader. And the things we talked about that night, as we go back to these questions, how long should a story be? I'm going to show you a couple examples of a short story and of some longer stories that both accomplish the purpose of the writer. And that's kind of what we discussed with Robin. And as we discussed it, and as he shared, is it needs to be as long as it needs to be to make a point. And again, we focus on the message. What's the message of the story? And can you deliver your message? You don't need to get overly verbose and long if your message can be delivered in a couple of paragraphs, if that's the story. Or if you have a story that requires some detail, as he talks about associated detail, I think that detail is necessary if it's not restating the same detail over and over and over again. So yes, it should be as detailed as it needs to be. And that's a kind of a vague way of answering the question, but provide the information you need to provide. Provide some detail that provides the context for people to understand the story, but you don't need to restate the same details in different words over and over again, because that's when it gets to the last one here, wordiness. Because you don't want your writing to be terse. You want it to be fluid and to flow, but to share. To me, it's about messaging. What's the message of the story you're looking to deliver? Why did you write it? Why did you want someone to read it? Why did you want to share it? If you deliver that message in 2 paragraphs, then you've done what you needed to do. If you need to add some more detail into your discussion, then you should do that. And so that's kind of the answer to this question. So we go to his next question. I don't advocate the 6th grade level, and I'm fine with big words and long sentences, but obviously within reason. And the answer to the second question is definitely yes. We should write in a personal history, in general, how we talk, as though we were telling the story, because we are telling the story. And then getting down to colloquialism, sometimes you need to use words that are period sensitive. They have something to do with the era, the time. And in fact, when we share a story today that we think is just normal verbiage, 20 years from now or 30 years from now, when somebody reads it, it may be a colloquialism to them. It may be a word that's unique to the area, and there may need to be some definition. So I started out, as we talked about this, with a discussion about that part. Because one of the things that we've done at Rememberize with a lot of the personal histories we've helped people produce is we produce sidebars. And to just briefly discuss what a sidebar is, a sidebar is ancillary information to the main story. It doesn't really, it would become wordy if you put it into the main story, because you don't want to be dwelling on details about terms or time period pieces or other things, but within the story, but you do maybe want to provide them for context. So this is an example from a page that we did at Rememberize. This is a story from Gwen Taylor, where she was talking about her grandpa moving out to his new home in Utah and having to live in a dugout. Now, to me, as I shared with Robin that night, the first thing I think of when I think of a dugout is one of those either at ground level or below ground level places where the baseball players sit while they're waiting for their turn to bat or waiting to take the field. That's a dugout. Now, obviously, that wasn't what it was to Gwen's grandfather, and it's not the only meaning of the term, but we found it helpful for her grandchildren in reading the story about their great-great-grandpa to put a picture of a dugout that he was talking about and a little description. A dugout, also known as a pit house or an earth lodge, is etc., and explaining what a dugout was and how they were built. And it was just a simple, short sidebar that helped define the term. Those are helpful. And those are helpful when you're looking back at historical information and you don't necessarily know what it is, or you think the people reading it right now aren't going to know what it is. And they could be helpful if you're defining something that you're using that might become more of an obsolete term later. So I would say keep that in mind as you write your stories, is you can use things like sidebars to help define terms and set context for a story and not detract from the story itself. So we talked about that in that webinar. So here, going back to Robin's questions, if I stop to smell the roses, should I describe the whirl of the petals and the curvature of the thorns and the refreshing, invigorating odors? And he says, I am not poetic, but some sunsets cry out for a special verbal treatment. Should I write about how something made me feel good or bad? Yes. The answer to the second question is yes. You don't need to be poetic, but some sunsets do cry out for special verbal treatment. And the bottom line to me, again, this is my perspective, the gospel according to Kurt Johnson when it comes to writing a personal history, is you're sharing stories. And the purpose of your stories is to tell how something made you feel. Why did you write it? What do you want someone to feel as they read it? What's the message they can get from it? So you definitely need to stop and smell the roses and describe some of the things and some of the thorns and the invigorating odors that you encountered along the way, because that's the way you build the context to share your message. When you think about the good writing that you've read in your life, it does that. And so that's a critical, answer to the question is yes. You don't need to be poetic, but you certainly should use your words to describe how you feel and how an event made you feel, an experience made you feel, because that's why you're sharing it as part of your personal history. So I did this, and I'm gonna jump to these right now. I'm gonna get out of this PowerPoint. I won't come back to it, except I might have to come back to this slide to remember what stories I was gonna share. But these are a few stories I picked out of Rememberize photobiographies that kind of go to the examples and go to the long versus short and the type of language to use that that Robin was asking about. And I want to kind of show these and use them to kind of discuss some of this questions. So we may come back actually and revisit this question. So I'm going to stop sharing for just a minute and come back, and then I'm going to share again, but I'm going to go and open up some of these stories. So we're going to begin with the sleeping on the floor story. And we're going to share that. So hopefully you can see that on your screen. This is a story, but it's 3 paragraphs long. This is in Jörg Baser, who is the founder of this company. It's in his autobiography they did with his wife about their life together. But this is in the first chapter, but talks about how they met. And Jörg shares a story, and the story is about. In fact, I'm going to read a little bit of it. He starts a story, but it's just a section of a chapter. It says "Sleeping on the Floor." That's the subhead. That's the title of the story. I did not have a bed at my house. When I was 7 or so, I once visited a man, a friend of my grandmother's, who had served in the military in World War II. And I was just in awe of this guy. He had a big scar on his arm where he got shot, and he told me all these cool things, all about being tough. One of them was, don't sleep in a bed. So when I got home from that little vacation, I said, I don't want a bed anymore. So they put the bed away. And he tells a story about putting the bed away, and he just slept with a sheet and a blanket put it in the closet, pulled it out at night, and he slept on the floor. And then the second paragraph of the story is actually his wife Desiree sharing that actually he had put that on his resume. Jörg and Desiree met when Jörg was an exchange student that came from Germany, where he lived, to her family's home in Oregon. And he actually put that on his resume, apparently, when he applied to be an exchange student. And it turned out to be a determining factor because at the time they didn't have a lot of space, but he said he could sleep on the floor, and he wanted greenery to wander in. So that became a selling point for him getting there into their home, because he didn't need to sleep in a bed. It turns out they had a bed and he still didn't sleep in it. But in those 3 paragraphs, he shares the detail of the story, which is that this military man who he idolized, honored, was in awe of, told him the story about sleeping on the floor, and then how it impacted him and why he was including it in the story. And it's just a short story. They don't have to be long. They can be short. So again, I'm going to go back and go to a second story and visit this again. So let me see. I'm gonna share the screen again and go to and kind of go to these stories now and talk about the different types of storytelling that we do. I'm gonna go back to Jörg Baser again, because this is one where detail was needed. Now I'm not gonna read this whole story to you because it's long. I'm gonna shrink it down so you can see it. This is the story Grand Canyon on a Can of Juice. This actually wasn't in a photobiography. This was one of our Stories of Life mini books that Jörg did, and it's from the lives of Jörg and his brothers-in-law, Rourke and Roman Fisher. And this is a story about when the 3 of them, when Jörg came to the United States in 1985 in the summer, and they decided to go to the Grand Canyon while they were traveling across the country. And when they decided to go down into the Grand Canyon on a hike, all they had was a can of Kern's nectar. That was their drink. They didn't take water. They weren't prepared. And there's a lot of detail in the story, and it's a long story. And they talk about, each of them share this, what it was like, Jörg thinking that it was just a short way, and his brothers-in-law get razzing him a little bit because they don't let him tell them the distance anymore. And then they talk about encounters with snakes and with the brush and crawling back out of the Grand Canyon. And there's great detail in this crawling out of the Grand Canyon and finding their way and then downloading from a soda machine all the soda they could find. And finally, each individually getting out of there. So it's a little bit of a long story, and sunburn and the climb. So they talk about a lot of things in the story and about life lessons learned as they climbed their way back out of the Grand Canyon. The story even ends with having lost a bike in the back of the truck when they were driving to meet Desiree later. So I share this because sometimes they do need to be long. They need to be as detailed as they need to be. And this one, told lessons, or in fact, it ended with lessons learned. And one of them was not letting Jörg judge the distances. But they learned that things that seem hard and miserable at the time can become treasured experiences. And this is one that he shares with his brothers-in-law. So again, sometimes they need to be long, and sometimes they need to be detailed. And the detail in this one is what makes the story. I remember when I worked with them on this story, just the detail of the crawling through the brush and hearing the snake, the rattle of the snake, and wanting to know where it was and throwing a rock to try to distract it. And there's so much detail in here, and obviously the details of not having any water. So anyway, that's another way to go about this, is to share the detail that you need. Sometimes the details are just short, there's just minimal details. Sometimes there's a lot of details. To answer Robin's question, do you share the ones you need to share? That one included a lot of stopping, well, they weren't really smelling the roses, but a lot of you know, some descriptive language about the things they were experiencing, because it was needed. The story about sleeping on the floor, that kind of descriptive language wasn't needed. I share these both because that's a way of seeing that different stories call for different treatments, and that's okay. And it's your story, so share it your way. I'm gonna go back and share the screen again. I'm gonna go back and pull up another story. This is a story that my uncle shared in a book he did in the chapter. This is actually when he was serving as a missionary in Madrid, Spain. And this is just a short, reasonably short chapter. Short, you can see it right there. It's 2 pages long in their book. And but there's enough detail in the story to know that they were approached by some pickpockets, and as these people came up to them, and he felt them grab his wallet that he hadn't put away properly that time, and take it. And then he chased. Or it was a gypsy who was picking his pocket, and he demanded it back and got it back. But then he shares this. They share a secondary story about a friend of theirs who had his passports stolen, and about my uncle Dick Merrill and this Elder Van Orden chasing these gypsies across town, and then wrestling with them on the train platform to get back his passports. So there's some detail in there, but it's short, to the point detail. There's some stuff about roses. There's you know, a lot of descriptive language, because that's how they told the story. There's also a note that they shared that we pasted in, that was what they had received from their missionary leaders that told them to beware of pickpockets. So again, shorter story, enough details to make the point. And so let me again stop sharing that and come back. I make the point that it's about having enough details to tell the story. We're going to go and do another. This is one with a little more detail. This is actually a story from the Weber, a story of the Webers and how they. In fact, this is pretty much their whole lives. Some stories from their whole lives. But this is Judy Weber, when she was 5 years old, was actually kidnapped while she walked out of church. And there's some great detail in the story. And again, this is one that covers a couple pages. And the meaning of her story was that she's a mother bear with her children, and she was worried about them because this had happened to her, and her mother didn't seem to think it was that big of a deal, and she never reported it. And anyway, they lived in Utah, and a man, she left church. Her mom sent her to walk over to an aunt's house that wasn't very far away. And so she left to do that, and this gentleman, or actually this was her grandmother's house, this gentleman picked her up and took her, and he was kidnapping her, and she ended up making him nervous enough with the whole situation that he let her out in the neighborhood where her aunt lived, and she was able to return home. Again, there's some details in here about the door opening and a crocheted handbag that she just had great love for, that she used to hit him and to make him nervous and to think this wasn't going to be worth it. Talks about where they drove and gave some details on the roads they were on for people who might be familiar with them, and where they did a U-turn. Anyway, medium length in a story, but has the details needed to tell the story, and certainly has the kind of language about her crocheted drawstring handbag that paints the picture of what that bag may have looked like, and the man in the black car, and things like that. So again, enough detail to make it happen, enough detail to tell the story. The kind of details that paint a picture, paint a word picture for people to understand, and mostly to get your message and the reason for telling the story. So we're going to do this one more time. I got one more on here that I put on here, and this is one that detail was critical to this story. This is a story by Don Andrews, who was a colonel in the military in Vietnam. And he's talking about a time actually when he was in Germany, when he was in part of his military career when he served in Germany. And he was right on the Soviet border. And he talks about navigational beacons. Now his message is, I'll go to the message first and we'll share it. His message is that bad things happen if you inadvertently follow the wrong beacon. And he even goes to the point of saying that Satan, the devil, has always got false things out there. He's trying to attract you and trying to say it's real. This is the right beacon. You're on the right one. And Don's point is bad things really do and happen even if you inadvertently follow the wrong beacon. So listening to false beacons and false claims can get you in trouble. That was his message. This is a story about his friend Mike Ellis. And he talks about how the Soviets would put these beacons on just across the border from the beacons on the German side, and they would have close enough signals that you might confuse them if you weren't careful. And his friend Mike Ellis, when flying back in on a helicopter, in fact did that. He fell for the fake Soviet beacon. He landed up landing on the wrong side of the border. You can see there's a picture of where they were. The Iron Curtain there, Czechoslovakia. They were in Grafenwehr. Anyway, and he talks about if you stray across the Iron Curtain, a couple of things happen to you, none of which is good. One is they shoot you down or they force you down. And they did get forced down. And then Mike was kept in a Soviet prison for over a year. They were claiming he was a spy. And then he goes on to say Mike Ellis didn't intentionally fly to the other side of the Iron Curtain, but he'd been trained not to. So there's enough detail in the story to paint a picture. You can imagine these two beacons on the two sides. We included an illustration that was created graphically to kind of show what a beacon looks like. And there it is, kind of protecting you from the bad side of the border. And that image kind of helps tell that story and helps paint that picture. This story is painting a picture, and it does a great job of that. So as I go out here, I do want to go back to the PowerPoint for just a minute, and let me first share the screen. Share the screen, and we'll go back to the PowerPoint for just a minute, because I want to go back now and revisit those questions. How long should a story be? There's not a minimum and a maximum length. As we've seen from these examples, it can be 3 paragraphs, 2 paragraphs, it can be 2 pages, it can be 6 pages. It can be as long as the Grand Canyon story with flowery, great detail that paints a picture. You can just imagine these 3 young men on their quest, a little bit of stupidity mixed in, and a whole lot of struggle and a life lesson learned. It can be any length it needs to be, and it needs to be as detailed as you need to be to paint that picture. To me, when you're telling a story, you're painting a picture. So don't worry about being terse. It's okay to be a little bit wordy, but you do want it to flow. And you do want to write how you talk, like you're telling someone the story. And again, we showed an example. If you're using terms that are kind of set to a certain time in history, you may want to provide some kind of a little sidebar box or something that defines those terms. And helps your reader who eventually reads this, maybe even someone 2 generations away, to understand what you were talking about. And maybe they'll have to get out the Google and go look it up themselves, and that's okay too. And then to visit this question, you don't need to be poetic, but some sunsets, some Grand Canyon stories do cry out for special verbal treatment. And that verbal treatment helps you help someone feel what you felt. And that's the reason for the story. I'm grateful for Robin and Paula for sharing some things with us. Some of these things came from them in our discussion. I'm grateful for the chance to share those examples. This is a great piece. The biggest reason I decided to re-record this, as bad as it is doing it in monologue, is that you get a message about, there were some great questions that Robin asked about writing. We worry about these things, right? We worry about how long do I have to write a long story? How much detail should I give? It's up to you. It's your story. But think about, if you're the recipient of the story, what information do you need to paint the picture that you're trying to paint? And then share it in your words. Thanks for joining us on this webinar. Have a great day. The next webinar, which we actually recorded last night, is also available. It talks about photos and how to use photos and maybe some things to do as you look through, search through your photos. Hope you'll enjoy that one as well, or any of the 7 that preceded this one. Hopefully we're giving you some good information. Thanks and have a great day.